So we're pretty much finished with the CAN network. I just have a couple of LRUs on this side of the aircraft and bundle up all the wiring that's not CAN and we'll be finished. But the one little trick that I have found based on the stuff that we discussed in a prior video that I would suggest on the PFD wiring is to take your CAN network into the P4601 connector and not into the manuals listed 4602, the P4602. So one thing about Garmin manuals that on the internet you see a lot of, I guess we'll just call it misunderstanding floating around. Those are the bare minimum of what you can do to at least get the results that Garmin, would advertise. It is not necessarily what you should do. They expect you to sometimes go further. Their manuals are written, and that's why their notes are so important. The manuals are written kind of from the perspective of, hey, maybe this is going in an old aircraft, or what's the bare minimum that it takes to make this thing work the way it should. And so that's the way a lot of the wiring diagrams are. That doesn't mean that's the way Garmin wants you to necessarily do it. When they do, they always say so, in my experience. So they have really good manuals that way. But by doing that on the PFD especially, you have all of your serial communication and all of your backups going into one connector, along with what we'd already established, one set of power and grounds. From a completely different source, you have power and grounds and your CAN network. And so the most horrible thing that everybody imagines or thinks of happening, that's to my knowledge never happened, but in theory could, is you go total blackout on both screens. If you don't go total blackout, a lot of times that's what everybody focuses on, but you can have a communication blackout where your screens basically don't know nothing. So in heavy IFR, like I wind up flying a lot, especially if you're headed to remote parts of the world, the most important thing, hands down, is obviously your ADAHRS unit, your air data heading and reference system. And this is why the G5s are such a neat little unit. But whether you have a G5 or not, in this case we don't, in order to get a good communication backup, you have all G3Xs. Garmin doesn't show it necessarily in their wiring diagrams, but in their notes they suggest, hey, we suggest you take a serial backup line from your G3X to the ADAHRS unit. And of course, that's what I've traditionally done. What I have found though, and there was a real world experience behind it, and then some more that I've heard of, is in the event for whatever reason, what typically ends up happening if you ever hear of anything going wrong on Garmin, this is what it is. Garmin has these really neat connectors. They're safety wireable, but they also have spring-loaded lock washers. They're you almost have to be careful how you put them on because they can be very difficult to come off. They don't come off by themselves. They work on this screw principle. You can see, and you can tighten these things down and they don't come off even under vibration. But then you can safety wire that. What happens is when you're having your aircraft serviced or looked at, could be like your, maybe biannual pedostatic leak down tests or whatever, and they're getting back in here, and maybe they need to work on something, or you need to pull this thing out. So in a lot of designs, especially these 10-inch screens, they're so large, it really pays just to be able to unplug these things and remove your whole unit. So in this case, you unplug these 4 plugs, that thing slides out the front, and you've got all kinds of room to work on anything inside this panel. And it's designed that way for a reason. You don't even necessarily have to remove the panel of the aircraft. But even just what I've done here, a lot of times people don't get these screwed back in. And in this case, I'm talking about most of the time professionals. There can be some off and on, off and on, and off and on. And in spite of all the training that helps prevent that from happening, occasionally you will see where these did not get locked back down. And especially in a high vibration aircraft, which like a 182 or something. They work loose and can, if they don't come unplugged, I try and even make my wiring harnesses where the wiring harness, I'm having to put back pressure against the wiring harness because it's trying to shove that thing forward. But it doesn't even necessarily have to come all the way plugged before you could lose, you know, if it loses communication for a few instants, then it's just going to alarm out and think it's got nothing. So what happens if something that should never ever happen actually does? The one time that I lost a plug, it was this one, when I lost all communication with a plug. And it was over something slightly different, but it was something like this. Everything was fine. Ironically, I was on an IFR flight. It wasn't, you know, overcast, or I was in a cloud at the moment it happened, came out of the cloud a few seconds later. And the whole system didn't skip a beat, and it was because of the serial backups. And also, for whatever reason, even though I had power 1 and 2 running through the same plug, it lost primary power, it lost access to the CAN network, it still had the backup power on. So the screen never even blinked. It just, you know, kicks off the autopilot, alarms out, lets you know that it can't see or talk to nothing except ADHAR's unit number 1. And so you lost true airspeed, you lost ground speed. But if you have communication with ADHAR's 1, it still had heading, you know, magnetic heading, still had attitude, heading, and reference system, and had all that stuff. So nothing went crazy. And you could even, you know, so it wasn't life-threatening, but you think about the fact that it really could have been. I don't know why it didn't lose. Now, of course, you had a backup screen, and it was totally functional. Nothing else in the entire system was bothered. And this does happen because of the back and forth and back and forth. Sometimes going back through, either one gets missed or it doesn't get locked down, and vibration, like I said, you know, Lycoming engines or older aircraft that vibrate a lot are kind of susceptible to this, and what should never happen, this thing comes unplugged. There is a cute little way to think about that, because even if you read NTSB reports, everyone plans for systems failing. You have to read long and hard, and you may not even come across one in the better part of a year where the system actually failed. It's something dumb, like the aircraft was serviced and the backup battery never got put in, or the primary power was never hooked back up and you were running on backup battery, and flight after flight after flight, it's backup battery, backup battery, backup battery, and then one day the backup battery runs out, or the flight's long enough that it runs out, and then all of a sudden they're in IFR, and that was it. And so STCs and all that stuff are written based on those kind of stories. So when you see something really stupid, it's because there was something a lot of times really stupid behind it, like a connector coming unplugged at the worst possible time. And you're probably not going to reach up under. In this one you could. In most aircraft, you're not going to reach up under there and plug that sucker back in. And so what would happen? Well, the way this is designed, I would suggest you bring your CAN network into the P4602. All your serial, this is going to be an MFD in this aircraft, but if this was the PFD, which this is the way I've wired this one over here, all of your serial is back over here. And on all of Garmin's wiring, and even in their connector kits, they really only deal with this connector. That's all they suggest. That's all you need. Everything, and I mean everything concerning a G3X can and usually does, in most harnesses, run through that connector. The P4601, it's an optional connector, but you can take both power sources into that. It's got 2 grounds, it's got a serial, which is the most important, and you can choose to take a CAN network through there. On the PFD especially, I would take the CAN network through there for 2 reasons. One is that it's much more difficult because CAN high and low is like 45 and 46 pin on this one. I've seen those crossed. I've done it once, a couple of years ago. And fortunately, I assumed, well, it's probably in the G3X, went right to it, and sure enough, it was. On this small connector, the odds of you crossing, your CAN network are slim to none. But on a PFD setup, what that does is, to get down to the nut cutting. If this connector came unplugged, your main connector right here, virtually nothing to speak of will happen, even if you were on an IFR approach. Your CAN network is still hooked up. So that's what it uses primarily anyways, so you lose nothing. It still is fully hooked up to an IFR navigator in case you were shooting a VOR. If you're, it is fully hooked through the CAN bus, because the CAN bus is running through the GAD29. The only thing you couldn't do is to essentially share flight information. If you wanted to load a new flight plan into the G3X, you would have to do it through the MFD. And the new flight plan would still be able to come in through the CAN network from the MFD, through the MacX portal. But flight plan crossfill is not going to happen, because you're going to lose something called a serial connect line that's in this plug to like the IFR navigator. In this case, it's a GTN 650. So if you were on a VOR approach, ILS approach, or even a GPS approach, totally unaffected. If you're in the clouds, everything's totally unaffected. So what happens if, for whatever reason, someone didn't, plug back in and lock down the little optional connector? If that thing comes unplugged, you lose your CAN network. But all of your serial backups, which is what it primarily wants to use, I mean, there it can see everything. It has access to everything that's on the CAN network, including your GTN navigator. But if you lose that little guy, you've lost your backup power source, because you didn't look, we've got our power sources and grounds split between them, and they're totally redundant. You only need one set of grounds and power. You only need one set of grounds and power in either plug. So if we lose the little guy, we lose our backup power. In this case, the way this is wired, you lose your backup batteries and your second source. So you could almost call it 2 and 3. And you lose your CAN network, which everything will continue to function. If you are on an ILS or VOR approach, it will be using serial data to transfer those to your PFD. Everything, of course, will still work in reversionary mode. So you still have a display that's fully functioning, but even your primary display function has all the communication it needs through the backup serial paths. You have a serial connection to your engine monitors. You have a serial connection to ADAHRS 1, which in turn gives you a connection to ADAHRS 2 through the CAN network. So everything works. Everything works if you lost your optional plug. Everything works except for a few little feature amenities if you lose your primary plug. But wiring it like that is not in the manual. And so you can think about it, or you can have kind of a real world experience. And fortunately, I did, serial backups to the ADAHRS unit, and as it worked out, I didn't lose power 2. And of all things, it would be on an IFR flight in the clouds, which is why we have backup displays and all that stuff. But in this case, it wasn't a display issue, it was a communication issue. So if I had been on an ILS approach, would have essentially lost all of your guidance and everything like that, because I'd lost CAN and I lost serials. So by splitting it this way, the only thing I had is air attitude. I would have had to use the second display to finish out that approach. But done like this, you could literally be on an IFR approach, worst case scenario. And if somebody besides you did not, servicing your aircraft, working on your aircraft, annual inspection, whatever, pulled out a display and it didn't get hooked back up. And it can be years down the road. It can be 5 years down the road, 10 years. Someone else could own this aircraft someday, and one day, somewhere, an AMP, pulls this panel out, doesn't get it hooked back in, and you're just on a VFR flight, and then, bloop, you lose your primary display. That is avoidable based on how the aircraft wiring is designed and laid out. You can avoid that essentially in perpetuity just by its design. On the MFD or your backup display, there's some reasons maybe we'll discuss later. If you look into the wiring diagrams, it's kind of self-explanatory. Run an RS-232. It's not really going to be used, but go ahead and run your backup. But you may want to go ahead and take your CAN into your primary connector. It is your backup display, and there's some other reasons to to do that I won't go into, but have you don't have all your primary stuff going into an MFD, so you can have your serials and your CAN on the same plug. But even then, if you split them on the PFD, there's not as many advantages to doing that, but there's some. When you have an opportunity like this, and especially a lot of this stuff even came to my mind when you're out in the boonies, out in the middle of nowhere, and you're sitting there thinking about, man, this airplane is literally my only path out of here to any kind of civilization for a couple of 100 miles, and I've got 400 miles of ocean to get over, maybe to get home, you know, up and down along the coast. You start to think about stuff like that, and, you know, even having a second, you know, air temp sensor to your second ADHARS unit. You really, really only ever need one, but if you stop and think about in really rough terrain, which with low weather reporting, outside air temp probe, especially a calibrated one, could be one of the most important pieces of equipment you have, because that's really going to be your true indicator of ice. And if they're not going to go bad. I mean, it's a simple solid state system, but what's it plugged into? And what if for whatever reason you totally lose that because of something silly? Be nice to have another one. So it's things like that that just kind of real world experience taught me, and I definitely wire them and build them differently because of it. But that's one thing that I've not ever seen or heard anyone talk about, and it's probably not even Garmin recommended, but it does absolutely work. And, you know, I mean, Garmin's not going to tell you not to do it. Keep in mind, it's just something that's not in the manual to take your power into those two plugs. I do believe they did that on purpose. I've not seen an exact STC, but I bet there is one where on certain aircraft they may say you need to take your power sources into each plug. You know, maybe they had to do that to get an STC on some type of aircraft. But to take your CAN network and separate it from your serial backups is actually most likely you're going to run into a communication issue before you ever run into a power issue. And I, you know, wished I'd built my first plane that way. Nothing would have been prevented because nothing happened, but I've already seen where, you know, in some aircraft it would have prevented an issue, and it will certainly prevent any issue going forward here.